Hello, everybody. Today we have another meeting realized by the UNESCO Chair on Intangible Cultural Heritage and Comparative Law of the University of Rome, Unitelma Sapienza. And today we have Professor Tullio Scovazzi, is Professor of International Law at the University of Milan, Bicocca, and is one of the most important experts of the UNESCO Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage. Thank you very much, Professor Scovazzi, to be here and to accepted our invitation. And I give you the floor, and thank you again for being part of our seminars. Thank you, Professor.
I was very glad to accept the invitation by my friend and colleague Pierluigi Petrillo to give a short talk about the Convention on the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. I was involved as the Italian legal expert in the negotiation for the convention, and it is an important convention, not only according to my view, but if we look at the participation by states to the convention, we find today that no less than 180 states have become parties to the convention. So it is a quite successful convention. Why it is important? Because it is a manifestation of the UNESCO trend to link culture and peace together. If you look at the constitution of UNESCO, which is an international treaty concluded in 1945, you see that wars begin in the minds of men. And it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So culture is a defense of peace, and the contrary of culture, that is ignorance, is linked to war. Also in the constitution of UNESCO, it is written that ignorance of each other's ways and lives has been a common cause throughout the history of mankind, of that suspicion and mistrust between the peoples of the world, through which their differences have all too often broken into war. So ignorance could lead to war, and culture leads to peace. What is the meaning of culture according to the UNESCO vision? Not only monuments, not only works of art, not only individual creations, but also social creativity is a component of culture. If we look at the declaration adopted by the World Conference on Cultural Policies, which was convened by UNESCO in 1982 in Mexico City, this concept, the social character of culture, is very well expressed. It is stated that the cultural heritage of people includes the works of its artists, architects, musicians, writers, and scientists, but also the work of anonymous artists, expressions of the people's spirituality, and the body of values which give meaning to life. It includes both tangible and intangible works through which the creativity of that people finds expression. Languages, rites, beliefs, historic places and monuments, literature, works of art, archives, and libraries. So there is a broad concept of culture, not only the creativity of single individuals, but also the creativity, the collective creativity of people. And that's the intangible cultural heritage. In the English language, the words intangible is used. In French, it is used immatériel. Immaterial in English has a quite different meaning. So the word intangible has been preferred for the English official text of the convention. So there is the so-called tangible cultural heritage. For example, monuments, cathedrals, theaters, and also examples of modern archaeology, so-called industrial archaeology, are included within the tangible cultural heritage. And this heritage is protected according to the 1972 Convention on the World Natural and Cultural Heritage. But there is also the intangible cultural heritage, which is not only monumental, but it is the product of the creativity of a community, of a society. So it has a very strong social component, and it has, I would say, a much stronger social component than the intangible cultural heritage. If we look around the world, the intangible cultural heritage is widespread everywhere, but in particular within developing countries, which are very rich in intangible cultural heritage. So the protection of the intangible cultural heritage is also a way to ensure cultural diversity by protecting a heritage which is typical of developing country. But not only developing country, also developed countries have quite a strong intangible cultural heritage. For example, the first state in the world that adopted a legislation for the protection of the intangible cultural heritage was Japan in 1950, a very developed state which has a sophisticated technology, but also is very much attached to the protection of the traditional cultural heritage, which is mostly composed by intangible cultural heritage. So the protection of the intangible cultural heritage is a way to protect cultural diversity. It is also a way to protect peace, and it is also a way to protect sustainable development. You know, the concept of sustainable development has been defined by the Rio Declaration of 1992 on environment and development. It is stated in the Rio Declaration that the right to development must be fulfilled so as to equitably meet developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. So there is a need to harmonize development and the protection of the environment. Development should not result in the destruction of the natural environment. And there is also the need to take into account the rights of the future generation that should receive a world heritage that is at least so good as the heritage that we have received from our fathers. Maybe it is difficult to balance environment and development. Maybe it is difficult to balance the rights of the present and the future generations, but this is the objective, to ensure sustainable development. And the intangible cultural heritage, which has normally a strong traditional aspects, is in many cases linked to the conservation and the sound use of the natural environment. So the intangible cultural heritage is also a means to protect sustainable development. Within UNESCO, it was felt that with the first cultural conventions, the Convention on the Protection of Cultural Heritage in Time of War of 1954, the Convention on the Illegal Movements of Cultural Properties in 1970, the Convention of the World Natural and Cultural Heritage of 1972, only half of the cultural heritage was protected. There was a gap to be filled as regards the intangible cultural heritage. And that's the reason why in 2001, the negotiations for the new convention on the intangible cultural heritage started, to fill a gap, to complete the range of cultural properties which were protected under UNESCO instruments. So, what is the definition of intangible cultural heritage, which is given by the convention? From the definition, the social component of the concept is very clearly expressed. The intangible cultural heritage means the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith. So one first element of the intangible cultural heritage is the manifestation of a given practice. And the practice is linked to a community. There is someone who is able to do something that is characteristic of that community. And the community is composed of individuals who recognize as part of the cultural heritage the practice. Then the practice is transmitted from generation to generation. It is constantly recreated in response to the environment where the community is located, its interaction with nature and history. For example, if a certain community is able in wood craftsmanship, it is linked to a certain forest which produces the wood to make the objects that are used in the practice of the community. So one of the first problems is how to identify the community, the community who bears the practice. So the community could be very small, certain indigenous communities that have a certain practice, for example, healing using elements, natural elements of forests, can be composed of very few individuals, not more than 50. And there are also very broad communities, for example, tango in Argentina and Uruguay, or flamenco in Spain. There are very broad communities composed also by people who perform different practice, for example, dancers or musicians. And this does not matter how many are the members of the community. It is important to identify a community. For example, I remember that we had the problem of identifying the community for the element Mediterranean diet. Pierluigi Petrillo was also involved in that problem, because it was originally proposed by 4 Mediterranean countries: Spain, Italy, Greece, and Morocco. But at first, with the first proposal, no specific community was identified in each of the 4 countries. And I remember that the committee established by the convention that at that time decided on the applications made some objections, because millions of people live in the 4 countries and no single community was identified. So the proposal was withdrawn. It was represented the next year, and we identify some specific communities inside the 4 countries. In the case of Italy, the community of the area of Cilento, south of Naples, where the Mediterranean diet was studied and developed for the first time, and with the identification of 4 communities within the 4 proponent countries, the submission was approved and the element was inscribed on the list. And it is important to involve the bearer community, involve the community not only in the proposal. The proposal must be presented with the prior informed consent by the community, but also after inscription on the world intangible list, to involve the community in the safeguarding of the element, in the adoption, for example, of a plan for the safeguarding of the practice. All must be done with the involvement of the community. Then there are other problems which are linked to the social component of the intangible cultural heritage. For example, whether commercialization of the element should be accepted, whether the selling of the practice for other people, for example, to record music and to sell it to other people not belonging to the community. For example, reggae music is included in the intangible list, so there are many bands which produce records and sell them to people all around the world. So many elements are commercialized, and there is the danger of changing, of altering the nature of the element as a consequence of commercialization of the element. And it has been stated, and in my opinion, it is right, that commercialization of the intangible cultural heritage is an expression of the viability of the heritage, and so it should be accepted, but it should be avoided that commercialization becomes a disqualifying factor, that it brings to excessive change in the nature of the element and distorts traditional cultural customs. So it is necessary to ensure that processes of commercialization remain under the control of the communities concerned and not of private companies which are stranger to the element. So, and the social component of the intangible cultural heritage is also linked to the problem of tourism. It is an expression of commercialization. Of course, tourism could be developed and encouraged, but also the profits coming from tourism must always be kept under the control of the community of bearers of the heritage in order to avoid that the true heritage is distorted for commercial purposes. Then another aspect of the social component of the heritage is transmission. The heritage is a living element. It must be transmitted from fathers to sons, from masters to pupils. Within the working place also there is a transmission of intangible cultural heritage, and transmission implies change. Once it is transmitted, it is almost inevitable that the heritage changes. It is inherent in the concept of intangible cultural heritage that a change should be accepted and tolerated. For example, there is a traditional dance which has been inscribed on the list by, I think, 3 African states, in which we have dancers who represent the spirit of the dead and the wild animals. Then there are other dancers who represent missionaries, who represent slave traders. That means that something happened in history, and the knowledge by the community changed, and new elements, not always good elements, entered into the knowledge of the community. And then there are also dancers today who represent motorcycles and helicopters. That means that within the traditional dance, something has also changed with the passing of times, and new elements are included in the practice. But the practice basically remains the same. So transmission, modernization must also be accepted as elements of the social component of the heritage. I remember that during the negotiation for the convention, a big discussion was held about the concept of revitalization. It is mentioned in the convention in Article 2, Paragraph 3, as one of the means for the safeguarding of the heritage, revitalization. But there were much doubts about anthropologists about the concept of revitalization, whether or not to accept it. What happens if a tradition dies, if there are no more people of the community interested in performing the practice? What should we do? Should we encourage the survival of the practice? We cannot force people to do something that they do not want to do. So one of the position was that the only thing we have to do is to document the last examples of the tradition for the archives, for the records, and let the tradition die. The other position was to encourage a revitalization, so to make every effort in order to encourage the maintenance of the tradition without forcing people. So that's also an aspect. And the last aspect I wanted to deal with, which is also linked to the social component of the intangible cultural heritage, is a condition which is expressed always in paragraph 1 of Article 2. For the purpose of the Convention, consideration will be given solely on such intangible cultural heritage as is compatible with existing international human rights instruments, as well as with the requirements of mutual respect among communities, groups, and individuals, and of sustainable development. Only if the intangible cultural heritage respects human rights, respects sustainable development, respects mutual respect among communities, it could be included in the lists established by the convention. I remember there was a discussion about the puppet theater, which was presented by Italy, and it is performed especially in Sicily, and it comes from the Middle Ages, from the Crusades, from the wars between the Christians and the Muslims, And there was an objection by an Arab state asking if this element respected the need of mutual respect among communities, because the Christian is always represented as the good character, and the Muslim is always represented as the bad character in the representation. And it is not easy to give an answer to this question. Of course, in the past, we had many examples of wars, of extermination by people, of people by other people, and this is reflected in the tradition. We cannot change the past, we cannot change the history, so the history remains the same and is reflected in the element. What is important is how the element is presented today, that today's it should not be presented again as a sort of war between a community and another community, but only as a representation of the past. So it is to be presented today with a different spirit from the spirit that it had in the past. So we can also accept the puppet theater. It is important to say today that the Muslim community has the same dignity as the Christian community, and the same with human rights. For example, certain traditions are reserved to men and are not open to women. For example, the whirling dervishes in Turkey, only men perform the dance. But it is not against the human rights, it is not against the rights of the women, how they are felt today, because it is a tradition that originated in the past. So the social component explains why human rights are important, and it is important to present the traditions of the past in the light of history and without denying history. But the fascination of the intangible cultural heritage is precisely represented by its social component. And I think I have exhausted my 30 minutes, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Scovazzi, for your talk, and thank you very much also for your suggestion on this convention. So I really thanks for being part of this seminar, and we finished with you today our talk. Thank you very much. See you soon, I hope.